Welcome, everyone. I'm Nahid Khan, the Communications and Marketing Specialist at the Immigrant Women's Information Network. On behalf of the IWIN team and staff, welcome to today's webinar, The Role of Intersectionality and Frontline Programming for Immigrant Women. As we gather in this virtual space, we acknowledge that we are meeting on lands that have long been home to Indigenous nations across Turtle Island. I am located on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. I also acknowledge that many of you are joining from different territories, each with its own histories, treaties, and responsibilities. At IWIN, we are committed to creating spaces that center Indigenous voices, histories, and perspectives. We recognize that reconciliation is an ongoing process that requires us to challenge systems of exclusion, address anti-Indigenous racism, and support Indigenous-led movements for justice and healing. May this acknowledgement serve as a reminder that we all share a responsibility to walk this path with care, humility, and genuine commitment to change. I'm so pleased to announce our speakers for today's webinar. We have Samia Hudson joining us today. Samia Hudson is the Executive Director of the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians, also known as CASA, where she has worked since 2015. She sits on several advisory bodies, including the Coalition Against Anti-Racism, OPP, and Peel Hate Crime Advisory Committees, Color of Poverty, Color of Change, and the Toronto Nonprofit Network. She was named a democracy superhero by Toronto Metropolitan University and selected as a Civic Action Diversity Fellow. Prior to CASA, Samia worked with the City of Toronto on affordable housing and municipal licensing, supporting low-income and marginalized communities. She holds a Master of Public Policy and BA in Sociology and Political Science from the University of Toronto, and is currently pursuing a second Master's in Islamic Studies. We also have Dr. Wafa Hassan joining us today as a speaker. Dr. Wafa is an assistant professor at the Women and Gender Studies Institute, University of Toronto, St. George campus. Since 2016, she has taught at U of T Scarborough, McMaster, and Brock University, with a focus on transnational feminism, decolonial theory, anti-racism, and anti-Islamophobia advocacy. Her research explores topics such as displacement, ethical solidarity, and the politics of feminist knowledge production. Her dissertation, Orientalist Feminism, Eastward Pedagogies, was nominated for the Governor General's Academic Medal. Dr. Hudson is also a frequent speaker at the national and international conferences on feminist and decolonial thought. As each presentation is being delivered, we kindly ask all attendees to type your questions in the Q&A box. We will spend the final 15 minutes addressing your questions. Wafa Hassan, we will now turn the presentation over to you. Welcome.
Hello, good morning and / afternoon, everyone. Thank you to IWIN for inviting me to speak on the topic of the role of intersectionality on frontline programming for immigrant women. I come to this topic as an Arab, as a Muslim, and as a Palestinian who arrived to Canada as myself as a refugee after being displaced multiple times before the age of 9, originally from Palestine, and then who subsequently navigated the social welfare state through women's shelters, government housing when it was the Metro Toronto Housing Authority in Toronto, as well as food banks, furniture banks, publicly funded summer camps, and so on. So I have that personal embodied experience, which I hope to share from an ethnographic perspective, as well as I come to this topic as a scholar on anti-racism and feminism, where I've studied various theories related to these topics, and I lean very heavily on Black and Indigenous feminist scholars for understanding my own reality. So IWIN does serve a broad audience and seeks to address these issues while being inclusive of many identities, but my presentation will admittedly focus on a particular area of study, which is Arab and Palestinian women's experiences on Turtle Island, and specifically Canada. And I sometimes refer to Muslim identities too, as it is interconnected to those identities for me. I'm quite sure that much of what I discuss today will be applicable to other communities. And as well, I think that this topic is sort of underdocumented And so I'm hoping it can, enrich your praxis in your various diverse contexts. And I would say that as an anti-racist and feminist praxis, I aspire to discuss topics that only have deep knowledge of. And so I do hope that that offers everyone some tools and ideas which are both particular to my community, but also applicable to other vulnerable communities. Um, if you could go to slide 2. Thank you. So what is intersectionality? We use the word a lot, we hear it a lot. And so I wanted to kind of sit with it for a little bit before we dive into the case study that I'm going to offer. In studying intersectionality, it is important not to an additive approach. So the idea of intersectional identities is meant to acknowledge the complexity of belonging simultaneously several axes of identification, not a kind of layered and fragmentable or compartmentalized modes of being. So it arose because the idea of an essential identity, like womanhood, for example, would never address the complexity of oppression for many people. And we learned this through the works and writings of um, Black and Indigenous scholars. And also seeing on the ground how policies were failing racialized women in particular when they would fragment out one particular part of their identity. So, for example, carceral solutions to intimate partner violence in racialized communities failed dramatically. Similarly, neither did race or anti-racism on its own either. So intersectionality is really the recognition of the many strands that make up our identity and the ways in which sexism, racism, classism, um, status issues are all intertwined in the identities of racialized families and racialized women. So there are, of course, many examples of the failures of fragmenting our identities, not least of which are carceral solutions, like I said, to intimate partner violence, but more simply, for example, in the ways that the early suffrage movement didn't address the experiences of Indigenous, Asian, Black women in Canada at the time. So when we try to approach an issue with intersectionality lens, it becomes really important that one does not adopt that fragmentary approach. So saying, for example, okay, we're going to address the racism in this compartmentalized way, and then we're going to address gender liberation in this compartmentalized way. Because oftentimes when we do that, we actually end up causing harm. And I'll explain why, both through an ethnographic experience, a personal experience, and also through a more empirical analysis. Um, and just to kind of not to be too redundant, but just to repeat that sometimes the liberatory frameworks for feminism meant simultaneous racial violence. And in reverse, sometimes anti-racist approaches would reinforce patriarchal domination. So it is difficult it is difficult work actually to try and to see the ways in which our identities are not just components of things, but that we require, honestly, a really different language that I would argue we still haven't really come up with. And all of this to say that I'm really happy that, this particular event that IWIN is organizing is sort of centering that complexity and coming at the topic in the spirit. So I would say that, as practitioners, as people who work on Frontline, it can be really tempting to adopt the additive approach. So, for example, there's a study that Lisa Bowleg was analyzing in her writing, where she actually criticized a study that asked Black queer women, "How does racism affect you?" or "How does sexism affect you?" She says, even our questions, while rooted in care, can encourage participants to disaggregate their identities. It can function as overly structured and closed-ended in their content, even if they appear to be open-ended. So instead, what she would argue we should ask for are meaningful constructs, like, for example, questions about stress or discrimination or prejudice, rather than demographic questions alone. So that's kind of a solution, perhaps, to how we ask our questions, how we come to inquiry around how we serve vulnerable populations. I know you probably all already know all of this. I just wanted to kind of ground us here before we dive into really very specific contexts. And as we approach, the various barriers of class, ability, gender, race, borders, citizenship, documentation, and so on. So for my presentation today, thank you for going to slide 3. I'll offer two approaches of analysis. The first is describing my own experience navigating the social welfare system in Hamilton and Toronto, and reflecting on the hybrid identities that I carried and continue to carry, and how that impacted my movement through various frontline agencies and with frontline workers. Secondly, I'll offer some empirical analysis of the socio-political and economic context. So more of the sort of theory and research that I'm doing around a very specific demographic. So it will be very specific to Arab and specifically Palestinian refugees in Canada, who are living at the intersections of race, gender, class, and status. Um, and hopefully the two will come together in the end to give us a kind of holistic view of what it's like for this particular community, as well as in general, what the Canadian landscape is looking like. So my own experiences. I came to this country as a refugee at the age of 9 after having been displaced multiple times, which of course meant that I hadn't actually been in any kind of schooling up until that age, and faced a lot of precarity in various ways. And then I was led into this country as a quote unquote so-called humanitarian refugee. Of course, this is a story of millions of Palestinians. As of 2023, UNRWA reported there are about 6 million Palestinian refugees. And now we know that within our cities here locally that there are thousands of evacuees coming from Gaza who are facing various barriers in healthcare, education, and we can talk about that more in the Q&A if you like. But I guess the reason I situate it this way is that folks often tend to think that these issues are new. And so I wanted to kind of center the story of this Palestinian refugee who came from the West Bank in the early 1990s, and that these issues have been here. These are not new, and that we do need to really address them because they are impacting many generations. So I will talk about what I benefited from. So I benefited greatly at the time from government housing or social housing. At the time, it was Metro Toronto Housing Authority, so it wasn't privatized at all at the time. It fast-tracked families that were facing intimate partner violence in their homes. So we got a house within a year for my mom and my two brothers after living at Interval House, which it was a very prominent women's shelter at the time for about a year. And so at the time, we got into a housing complex in North York before North York became more gentrified, and so it gave us access to really amazing public resources, including like swimming centers, sports centers, as well as a great school. Of course, government housing became more privatized in the 2000s, and we can talk a little bit more in the Q&A about that as well. But just very practically, what that meant for my single mother was that parking spots were now monetized, and the laundry cost the money to use and things like this. And then private security was hired for our sort of what I started to call like a little enclave. We became a very kind of isolated community. But nevertheless, I was able to take dance and ballet in this art school that was publicly funded and available to our community. I thrived. I benefited from publicly funded summer camps, amazing memories. And then I put myself through university. And now I am one of the very few Palestinian professors in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area. There are very few of us. So this is all very good. But the racism that we encountered through this journey was severe and intense. For example, when we would go to food banks at the Salvation Army or other places, we would be told, "You're Muslim, why are you here? You should go to your mosques to get food." Essentially positing us as that these services were not for us. So positing us as sort of extraneous to the Canadian project or the social welfare state, that these services were not meant to be serving Muslims. And then we got the same kind of treatment at times at furniture banks. Often we would be given things like expired food, or we would, like I said, we would be told to go to our mosques for help. At that time, we didn't have places like Nisa Homes or Sakina. So these are really amazing initiatives that I wish were there earlier, but I'm so grateful that they're here now. Um, it also meant that I could not always speak completely freely about my feminist identity and my feminist desires because of the ways that it would be often weaponized to produce more justification of violence against Muslims and also violence in Palestine, which was the original wound. The displacement from there was the original wound from which all of this displacement and precarity and fragmentation stemmed. And so, as immigrants, as refugees, we have to sort of navigate that fragmentation of being able to sort of articulate our liberatory politics in one way, while also being careful not to feed into the same discourses that were justifying the violence against our bodies and our displacement in the first place. So that was a difficult fragmentary experience that we felt very young, at a very young age. Most notably, too, I faced, and I think a lot of the youth share this that I work with, is that we face a disconnection from our language, our extended family, our culture, and this was kind of a part of a cultural erasure that many of us face in our displacements. So all of these disconnections, the latter disconnections, were not addressed in frontline services offered to me, and so. Um, in contrast, they were actually contributing to the erasure of my identity often. And so that was a way in which many liberatory spaces were also causing racial harm for me. Um, I'll just say very quickly that at the time that we were facing, high, intense financial difficulties, hardships, and cultural barriers, um, my brother, one of my younger brothers, went to his, the school that I just, shared was so wonderful, in grade 9. And this was in 2004. So, gosh, a long time ago, many decades ago. And he was told to remove his kufiyeh by his science teacher or to get out of the class and he was met with rage from that teacher, who told him that Palestine doesn't exist. So he's wearing his kufiyeh. It was a cold day. He's living with a single mother in government housing, we're all trying to kind of pull our weight. And that's the kind of experience that he was experiencing in a publicly funded school. And so he was kicked out of that class and then he had to sit out. So I just kind of want to thread the needle of what that kind of initial displacement looks like and then how it continues on into the immigration and subsequent processes of trying to live here. Of course, Arab youth today must navigate discursive worlds where they face the tropes of so-called terrorists daily, including today my own son. So with all of these realities, it is difficult to address a culturally responsive approach by singling out one particular identity. So when we look at this, larger story, it's hard to think about a kind of liberatory praxis that only pulls out one part of these identities, like gender, like race, like status. And I will add to that in a minute about class, which I think we really need to sit with when it comes to the Arab Canadian population. So just before I get to that, I do want to say that we did benefit a lot from feminist theories and activisms around belief activism. And that's what produced things like women's shelters and fast tracking social housing. So I benefited a lot from the belief activism from a feminist perspective, but that was contradicted by the disbelief culture around my identity of origin, as well as the erasure of Palestinian identity, and the history of Arabs and Palestinians in social welfare and education systems. This is heightened by racial profiling by police of Arab youth, which I can also share more in the Q&A, and later facing systemic discrimination at work and in schools, which again, I can share more in the Q&A. So how can I relate these ethnographic stories to the socio-political context? So we can go to the next slide, in which we find Arab and Palestinian immigrants facing today. When it comes to class, I argue there is not enough attention paid to the fact that Arab Canadians face one of the highest poverty rates among racialized communities in Canada. So I would like to repeat what I just said. Arab Canadians face one of the highest poverty rates among racialized communities in Canada. This is not only a fact that should be well known to frontline workers, it's quite shocking when you look at the numbers, which I'll share in a minute, but it is also a feminist issue. So, according to the 2022 Canadian Income Survey, Arab Canadians had a poverty rate of 18.7%, and this was notably higher than the national average of 9.9, and the average among visible minorities, which was at 13% in the same year. Arab Canadian poverty has been increasing markedly. Today it's at 18.7. In 2021, it was 12.8%. That's a significant increase. And according to the same report, Arab Canadians had one of the highest poverty rates among all racialized groups in Canada, surpassing Black Canadians, South Asians, and Chinese Canadians. One may think that this is related mostly to first generation new immigrants or refugees, but in fact, according to a 2023 Statistics Canada study on intergenerational poverty, Arab Canadian poverty continued well into third generation demographics. And while it does decline slightly in the second generation Arab Canadians had a poverty rate of 14% in 2020, which ranked fourth highest among all racialized groups. Only 1% higher than Black Canadians, for example. So while much improved, third generation Arab Canadians continue to face higher poverty levels than white Canadians in the third generation. So what about when it comes to Arab Canadian women? That's the next slide, please. So according to Statistics Canada 2024, there was a study on older women in Canada, and 16.8% of Arab women aged 65 and older were living in poverty in 2020. The highest poverty rate among the 6 major racialized groups of older women. So Arab women had the highest poverty rate among other racialized older women in Canada. The same study reported that 31.5% of Arab senior women experienced low income, placing them at the top among racialized older women, notably higher than Filipino or Black women in the same age group. According to a separate 2021 census analysis, Arab women in one-parent immigrant families had the highest low-income rates as well, 38.6%, compared with other groups. So this indicates significant economic vulnerability tied to both gender and family structure. According to labor market data in 2021, that includes all age groups, Arab women had the lowest median market income among all racialized women. So that's the economic landscape. And I think that class issue and that class reality is, we can't really escape that when we're thinking about any kind of liberatory politics when it comes to the Arab Canadian and Palestinian population. Culturally, immigrant Palestinian, Arab, and I'll leave it there, Palestinian and Arab families are suffering with overall well-being when it comes to our education system and our workplaces. In a recent study that I conducted in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area public school systems, which is yet to be published, this is unpublished data, and I will share it with Iwan once it is published. It is under review, where I conducted focus groups with Palestinian students from grades 4 to 12 and other Arab communities as well, not just Palestinian. But I'll share a couple of stats with you from it. It's a long study, but just notably, 90% said that APR affects them directly or indirectly. 72% had experienced silencing. 34% of Palestinian students had experienced reprisal, meaning some kind of punishment related to their identity. 94% said that their history was not reflected in their curriculum. And 22% reported that it had an impact on their family's well-being. And 22% also said that it affected their professional opportunities. The impact on Palestinian students have meant that 41% experienced physical reactions like panic attacks, fatigue, sick stomach. 42% reported an effect on their academic success and their focus. So, Nahida, I'm going to ask you to just kind of go through the next few images with maybe pausing for a few seconds on each one. You'll see the images here produced by Palestinian and Arab youth in the GTHA about how it feels to be in school today. So I'll just pause for about 10 seconds on each slide. You go to the next one. With this image, it's clear the transnational sort of psychic worlds of Arab youth in Toronto, thinking about what's happening over there and really disrupting the local global binary that we're often asked to take. Oftentimes, immigrants are asked to say, well, that's what's happening there, leave that there, we're in Canada now. But this really, this image, this picture really indicates the kind of transnational lives that we carry in terms of how we understand family and connections, many connections, including economic, familial, etc. Next slide, please. This was by a high school Palestinian boy. It was called The Voice Inside. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So I'll leave it on this slide as we go over the next few stats. But this one for me was particularly heartbreaking as we have witnessed an uptick in Arab and Palestinian young boys, indicating severe mental health impacts of not only what's happening transnationally, but also how they're being read by various community spaces here in the GTHA. So of course, I don't have enough time. I'm going to be concluding soon to go into the interviews that if we could stay on the previous slide, thank you so much. I don't have time to go into the interviews that I also did with Palestinian mothers, fathers, and whole families, but I will say that the overall impression is a fear of many public institutions, that social institutions are not safe. In fact, 44% of Palestinian students have actually hidden their identity from others, or said that they were Lebanese or Egyptian, chose a different identity group. To add to that, I want to say, and this is a really important statistic, that 60% of Palestinian students said that their family members or parents encourage them to hide their identity. So I think this leads us to the conclusion that frontline help with vulnerable Arab and Palestinian immigrants needs to always account for, and that we can go to the next slide. Thank you, Nahid. That we always need to account for how poverty levels affect housing, which has an impact on feminist freedoms to seek out alternatives to unsafe and abusive relationships. This poverty is connected not only to the relations of displacement, which caused the immigration in the first place, particularly for Palestinians, that is settler colonial and Euro-American imperial projects in the Swana region. But this poverty is also connected to systemic anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobia in Canada. And so this means that for a feminist and anti-racist class-based approach to immigrant advocacy and frontline care, we need to consider relations of erasure, denialism, systemic discrimination in work and education, its relationship to feminist freedoms, which include intimate partner violence, the risks that it takes not only to leave economically, but also the risks for familial well-being, that there is really no documented published information about CPS, familial fragmentations, but we do have some stories that I can also share in the Q&A about the risk of the familial fragmentation within our public school systems through Orientalist tropes of Arab and Palestinian families. And finally, carceral and police targeting of Arab youth that the Palestine Legal Support Committee are calling the process is the punishment. So due to the high poverty rates, the reason I really wanted to focus on the high poverty rates of Arab Canadians and specifically Arab women is that it makes sense actually for everyone to be helping Arab women as a priority site for feminism, for class-based advocacy, helping poverty and homelessness, considering the high rates that we're seeing. For improving rates of intimate partner violence, we cannot ignore Arab women. For mental health for youth and families, as well as a focus on anti-racism, we really cannot ignore these staggering statistics. Knowing the stats that we showed today, it's really impossible to work on the front lines with immigrant families without really addressing poverty levels because it impacts feminist freedoms, it impacts choice, and it also is fed by systemic discrimination in work and schooling. So all of those topics, speaking of intersectionality, need to be sort of worked at simultaneously, and we need to devise strategies for folks to navigate education spaces, workspaces, knowing these realities as well. I will say that these are the ways that for me, class issues, feminism, and racism are all interconnected and related. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wafa. That was a very thought-provoking presentation. I know I definitely enjoyed it. The following slides are from the recorded presentation delivered by Samia Hassan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to present this webinar. I sincerely apologize for missing the webinar earlier today. I had a bit of a family emergency. Before I start, my name is Samia Hassan. I'm the Executive Director for the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians. I'm currently on maternity leave. And again, my apologies to the attendees, the organizers, my friend Wafa, for missing the webinar and also sudden and not being able to give any notice. I do want to make up for it, and I'm recording my presentation that I had prepared in advance. And I apologize that we can't have a discussion, but if anybody wants to reach out to me, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn, and you can get my contact information there from the organizers, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Again, like I said, I'm currently on maternity leave, and so that goes back to what I'm presenting on today in terms of intersectional feminist frameworks. And so, all of us come from different backgrounds and have different barriers and intersectional identities. And so how we perform and how we show up and how we do our work has an impact, obviously, in all of these identities that we carry. So again, I apologize for missing the earlier webinar, but I hope that the information that I'm presenting to you today will have some impact in how you do your work. So before I start, I'm sure that during the webinar earlier, there was a land acknowledgement, but I'd like to just acknowledge that I'm currently joining you from traditional Indigenous territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and most recently the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, see Takaranto, the traditional Mohawk name of this area called Toronto, which means trees in the water, and its surrounding areas are still home to Indigenous people. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to meet, work, and play on this territory as settlers. So based on my conversations with the organizers, there's a few objectives that I want to accomplish through this brief webinar recording. By the end of the session, we'll walk away with some tools to embed intersectionalities into your program. So whether that's from design all the way up to evaluation, we'll hopefully have some increased awareness in how well-intentioned programs can even exclude some people intentionally. We'll create some strategies to make services more equitable and not just equal, and we'll provide some examples of organizations that are already doing this work really well. And I wanted to, have some discussions, but again, like I said, unfortunately, I wasn't able to do that, but I hope we'll run into each other in the future sometime and we can have a better discussion at that point. And I'm sure this may have come up in the webinar, but I'd just like to go over what is intersectionality. I know it's become somewhat of a buzzword these days. Um, but for a lot of us that are living intersectionality, it's way more than that, right? So intersectionality was actually a term that was coined by a Black feminist scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. So it's not just something new that millennials have come up with. And it's not just about diversity, but it's rather about recognizing how different systems of power, so such as racism, sexism, ableism, overlap to create unique barriers for certain communities that have, again, different barriers and different identities. So, for example, a racialized woman that has a disability or a visibly Muslim woman that has a disability may face discrimination differently than a white woman with a disability, or even a racialized man with a disability for that matter. And then how do we apply intersectionality to a feminist framework? So we do that by centering lived experiences of marginalized women and gender diverse individuals into our work. So again, intersectionality is not just about translations, and it's not just about providing services in different languages, but actually understanding the lived experiences of different communities and different women and gender diverse individuals. It's also about challenging power dynamics in service delivery. And finally, designing programs that adapt to the diverse needs of women and gender diverse individuals rather than, again, a cookie cutter approach or a one size fits all approach. And so in frontline work, what does this mean for us? We normally, when we're addressing gender issues, it's a lot of organizations are not looking, again, at different identities. They're not considering things like race, class, immigration status, and so even things like their living arrangements, their education status. So all of that has an impact in how we address gender issues. If some people are living in situations where they're experiencing gender-based violence, or if they're experiencing intimate partner violence, that all has an impact in how we create programs for these communities and these individuals. And so why does intersectionality matter in service delivery? We need to first understand why we cannot afford to take the traditional model approach, and why we cannot afford to ignore intersectionality in our service delivery. A traditional model approach is, like I said, it's a one-size-fits-all approach, and it assumes that everybody requires the same type of service. So you design a program without considering how different women with different identities can face higher barriers. So even something like an employment program, if you're not considering intersectionality, you're basically designing something without looking at, for example, how racialized women have higher barriers to accessing job security. So all of that is really important in service delivery. For example, another example is if you're creating a food bank, for example, and you are only opening the food bank during weekdays, during work hours, and because that's where your staff are able to work. However, you're not serving a lot of communities and a lot of marginalized people by creating that kind of program. So, for example, working single mothers that work during the day, they may not be able to access, much needed support with food for themselves and for their children. So we really need to ask ourselves, like, who are we missing from by creating a program like this? And when we continue to ignore intersectionalities, what happens is we are reinforcing the very inequalities, inequities that we're aiming to solve with the program. So it's really important to not compound discrimination by creating these kind of programs. So another example I wanted to unpack just to give you a better understanding. So for example, if we're trying to create language classes for newcomer women, let's just make it a little bit more targeted. But then we are creating fixed schedules for those classes. So they're either Sometimes I've seen these classes at night. Sometimes I've seen these classes during the day, but it's not very common to have options for people. So to have options early morning, to have options during the day, to have evening classes, because no matter, like, if we're very rigid and we have fixed schedules, we will definitely exclude a lot of marginalized communities from the programming. Another aspect we want to possibly look at, obviously it depends on funding and those kind of things, is do we have childcare available, for women that are coming, newcomer women that are coming to the language classes program. If it's during the day, they might have children that are not yet in school or in daycare. They might not be able to afford childcare. So are we able to provide them free childcare so that they can take on the language class programs, which will help them secure employment. And obviously, then it becomes, one thing after another. They can secure employment. It can improve their overall well-being, the well-being of their children. So just, us designing these programs with this intersectionality in mind will result in a lot of positive consequences afterwards. And then we also need to keep in mind that as we're designing the programs, we are not reinforcing gender and class disparities. And then we're also not creating the designs from a place of privilege. So even speaking from personal experience, I'm somebody that may have certain areas of privilege where other people may not. So it's really important, even as a racialized, visibly Muslim woman, that's a mother of 3 children. I do have obviously some barriers to access in a lot of places, but at the same time, I also exercise a lot of privilege in other areas. So I need to make sure that when I'm creating programs, I'm not letting my privileges get in the way of how I create the programs and making them rigid for other people that have additional barriers. Embedding intersectionality in program design. So some key strategies: co-design. So everybody's probably heard of the phrase "nothing about us without us." And again, it's become a bit of a catchphrase, but it's so crucial to involve those communities that we're partnering with in our program design from the beginning. So, for example, I've done some work with the Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council, TASC, and they always involve their community. So if there's a program about elders, they're always involving Indigenous elders in their program planning. So it needs to happen so that you can build that trust and safety with your clients from the start. Offering flexible structures, so things like hybrid programs, so you can have online and in person. If you're charging fees, so sliding scale fees based on people's income. Offering childcare, like I mentioned, this all improves service relevance, especially for those people that have layers of barriers, and it also addresses accessibility needs at the same time. And then being culturally responsive, again, another buzzword, but really training our staff on what it means to take an anti-oppressive approach, an anti-racist approach, and hiring diverse team members at the same time that understand what anti-oppression is and what a trauma-informed lens is and what a culturally responsive approach is. And this all strengthens our organization's equity and accountability to our clients. So overall, taking these strategies will help promote a long-term systemic change for organizations. Intersectionality in program delivery. So there are certain actionable steps that we as staff, so we may not all be in managerial positions, but if we do have access to our managers that can take some of these actionable items, we may not be able to take them ourselves, but we can also be advocates for taking these actionable steps. So, for example, hiring diverse staff with lived experience, training staff on what implicit bias and anti-oppressive practices are, like I've already mentioned, using inclusive languages and gender-neutral forms, offering interpretation services and accessibility accommodations for people, creating trauma-informed and flexible programs, again, that are co-designed with clients. So some examples of this are creating a audit forms, for example, that have inclusive language. It could be, instead of saying mother or father, you say parent, right? So those kind of small details will really create an inclusive approach for people, again, that have multiple barriers. And again, one of the things, the approach where you're hiring staff with lived experiences to work with people, that cannot be replaced with interpretation services. I know a lot of private businesses are working with marginalized communities, and then they think that they could just hire a private interpretation service to basically have communication with their clients, and that's it. But it's a lot more than that, right? So people that have the lived experience, they understand what that community is going through. They understand what that family is going through. They understand what that individual is going through. And with obviously the training and education and background required to do work with marginalized, vulnerable people, that is the best approach to work with an intersectional lens, as opposed to trying to just tackle language barriers only, and because obviously there are funding constraints and those kind of things. But I think as a sector overall, if we really push and advocate for this holistic approach, we'll have a lot better service outcomes for our communities. And then evaluation. So obviously, I think in our sector, we're a little bit behind in how we evaluate programs. Sometimes we create programs based on what we think will work for people, but because times are changing, people's capacities are changing, people's identities are changing, people's mental health states are changing quite quickly, and especially because of everything that's happening in the world, everything seems like turmoil. We really need to see if our approaches are actually supporting people or not. And so if the way that we're designing our programs and our services are not helping people, we need to change the way that we do this work. So some of the questions to ask if we're doing an equity impact assessment to see if our programs are truly equitable and not just equal, we need to ask who is accessing our services, who is not accessing our services. We need to include marginalized voices in our feedback mechanisms. We need to make sure that our success metrics are inclusive. So we need to look at people's well-being and not just kind of hard data based on who is employed and who's not employed, but also some of that qualitative data on people's quality of living and their well-being is also very, very important. So some success stories that I wanted to share from the sector, the settlement sector. So OCASI is a very near and dear organization to me and to CASA. And so they've created some amazing programs that are very, very good at looking at the intersectional feminist lens. So OCASI has a gender-based analysis plus approach where it ensures that settlement services address barriers like childcare for racialized women. So the GBA Plus is an analytical framework that they've worked on, and there's a lot of tools that they've created that assess how diverse groups based on gender, race, disability, sexual orientation experience settlement services differently. And so they apply this approach and this lens to things like refugee and immigrant support services, to employment services, to language training, which I gave an example of, to housing and healthcare access as well. So they've used their GBA Plus lens for a lot of these services that their members offer. Another one is the FCJ Refugee Center. And these folks have created a program that advocates for the LGBTQ plus refugees by addressing both the migration and queer identity barriers. So they provide specialized assistance for LGBTQ refugees that are navigating Canada's asylum system, including help with refugee claims based on the sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression SOGI framework. So they through this approach, they're addressing barriers such as race, HIV status, trauma that can, make a lot of challenges for LGBTQ refugees. So they've done a really great job in this intersectional advocacy for LGBTQ initiative that they've created. And you can definitely visit each of their websites to get more information on how these programs were created and how they've supported the settlement sector overall. Practical tools and resources. So again, you don't have to start from scratch. Like I said, the term intersectionality was created in 1989. So there have been a lot of tools and resources already created. So it's not like we're asking you to do this from scratch. There's a lot of free resources that are already out there. For example, the Canadian Women's Foundation has a gender equity toolkit that includes an intersectional evaluation framework. The Barbara Schleifer Clinic also offers a lot of workshops on trauma-informed feminism. There are many checklists that are also available, including, like I mentioned, OCASI. They have an applying an anti-oppression framework in immigrant and refugee serving sector checklist. So this checklist actually is assessing bias, accessibility, and inclusivity in programs. There is also a lot of audit tools that organizations have created. For example, the Canadian Council for Refugees has an equity audit tool. Their resource is called the Equity Toolkit for Refugee Serving Organizations. The Equality Institute has an intersectional gender audit tool called the Intersectional Gender Audit Toolkit. So there's a lot of things out there. Now you can, Google search it, use AI to search it for you. There's a lot of different ways that you can embed intersectionality into your feminist framework in the way that you do work at your organization. So what do we want to do? I know that I've talked quite a bit, and again, I apologize, this is a one-way conversation. What we are doing, what should we do with the information that we've learned today? There are certain calls to action that I would like to ask of you. First of all, commit to one change this month. So even if it's something small, like adding pronouns to intake forms, that can really make certain marginalized and vulnerable communities feel welcomed in your organization. Collaborate with marginalized clients as co-designers, not just recipients. And I would say this from the very beginning stage, when we are applying for grants to do programming, we should seek partnerships at that point from marginalized communities and marginalized clients before we even put, pen down to paper to say to our funders, this is what we want to do with this particular program. We need to have the input of the clients that we're trying to serve as co-designers of the programs. And then challenge policies that ignore intersectionality in your organizations or in other organizations that you're attending events at, or you have colleagues and friends at. So you need to really look at what is the eligibility criteria, for example. Is it a rigid criteria? Is it exclusive to certain communities? So as frontline serving organizations that are committing to an intersectional feminist framework, these are some of the questions that we need to ask. And so again, I apologize we couldn't do this discussion, but I think on your own and with your colleagues, these are really, really great questions to ask, to have a discussion on. Maybe in your next staff meeting, you can look at how do we advocate for intersectionality with limited funding? So I know funding is always a challenge. What if leadership resists to these changes? So some of us might not be in leadership positions. What do we do in that case? How do we handle pushback? Like people say this is too political. Again, intersectionality is just a buzzword and it doesn't really mean anything for us. So what do we do in that kind of situation when we have these kind of pushbacks? And so, all of this will help look at some of these challenges that we have in applying those frameworks, and then how can we support each other? So that's another thing. I think if we have more of these kind of webinars, I know that there's a lot of organizations that are doing this type of work in the settlement sector. In the future, if we do have an opportunity to meet again, I think that's a very critical question for us to ask, is how do we support each other? How do we share resources? Because so that kind of goes back to the first question that we wanted to explore in terms of how do we address this with limited funding. But if there's some organizations that have more funding than others, how can we support each other with sharing of resources? So that is the presentation that I had planned for the webinar today that I missed. Again, I apologize. And again, sometimes life just happens and you have to roll with it. And that was a situation with me today. But I hope that we can cross paths again, and I hope that you enjoy this short webinar. And again, if there's any questions or if there's people that want to further this conversation, please do look me up on LinkedIn, because I'm currently on maternity leave from CASA, so I'm not able to answer emails on my CASA email. But if you send me a message on LinkedIn, I'll be happy to have that conversation and discussion with you. Again, apologies to the organizers and my friend Wafa for missing the earlier webinar, but I hope that people really learned something today from my presentation and can carry it forward in the work that they're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Samia, for that thought-provoking presentation. That being said, we will go ahead and move into our Q&A segment. If you have any questions for our speaker at this time, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box, and we're looking forward to an engaging discussion. So I do have a question right over here, and this is a thought-provoking question for Dr. Wafa. So hello, my name is Seher Suleiman. I am a qualifying registered psychotherapist and project coordinator at Human Endeavor, which is a non-for-profit organization serving vulnerable populations, including immigrant women. I am really inspired by Dr. Wafa's journey of moving from Palestine as a refugee in childhood and going through the whole institutional system, starting from a place of trauma and growing to become the successful woman that she is. When it comes to adverse childhood experiences, people generally get stuck at dark places and are not able to progress and grow through adulthood the way that she did. Which resources helped her to shift the trauma narrative to a journey of growth? And how would she suggest people to cultivate those resources for collaborative growth?
First of all, thank you for those very kind words. I think the reason I do this work is because I'm so aware that my story is not related to anything that I did specifically. It was the luck that I had with, and this is why I kind of tried to highlight so much how things have changed, is the luck that I had with the offerings that I was given. So it's in defense of the social welfare state, as problematic as it even was in the 90s. Of course, things have gotten much worse with the advent of neoliberalism, austerity measures, the gutting of lots of these public institutions, because I was able to benefit from community resources that would come to actually heal, correct, and offer me opportunities. So like I cannot say that it was something specific that I did. I would like to attribute some of it to the strength of Palestinian mothers who always give us pride in our identity, and always teach us our values and character regardless of where we are. So even when we were living in women's shelters and the food would come, she always taught us that you don't actually run for the food and try to get it first. You wait till everyone else eats and then you go. I attribute that to my culture, which is a difficult thing to talk about currently with the ways in which those resources are being that culture is being compromised. But I will say now, aside from that, from attributing that those flowers to my mother, I will say beyond that, that I benefited from, like I said, the free summer camps. So I lived in the Willow Tree. It's a government housing complex between Shepherd and Finch on Willowdale, and it hadn't been very gentrified as an area yet. I remember people protesting that there was a no frills in the neighborhood, and that it should be something more, upscale for the incoming um, immigrants who were, maybe it was like their second home or they were buying condos in the area. So I got a very firsthand experience of what gentrification can do. And eventually they did remove the no frills, and we didn't have a car. We used to walk for 45 minutes in the winter to get groceries, pushing my brother in his stroller. And so now our walk was much longer than that because we had to go to the other no frills. Or the food basics. So I'm really just giving the nitty gritty here of what the things that I witnessed and watched, um, because we talk about these things often theoretically, and I'm sure many of you have had these experiences as well, but they really do have very concrete impacts on folks. So, for example, being able to so I went to Earl High Secondary School and they had this art school that was connected to it. I could take an elective and dance. It was like the first time I could actually explore my creativity out of survival mode. And I think that gave me some resources of healing. I think getting to take English literature and reading about Black and Indigenous women's lives changed my life. Having a teacher that was not so stressed and wanted to teach us literature. Interval House organized every summer. They organized a trip to Ontario Place when it was still a thing, and that was something we look forward to all year because oftentimes immigrant families don't have the luxuries of being able to do these expensive fun things. So free trips to Canada's Wonderland or Ontario Place was something we would look forward to all year. And sometimes Interval House would organize these barbecues and things like this that we would go to. And then they would bring donated clothes and we would go through them. And I think all of those things taught me that in order for any of us to survive, it takes more than a village. It takes all of us. And so I want to, I guess I do this work and I'm here today to continue to share the incredible positive impact of the work that you're all doing. And the incredible domino effect that it has. And not just in my life, but in lives I've seen around me. And I hope that the work I've done today I saw a lot of women in the women's shelters, question their identities and their religious identities because they were internalizing the colonial narrative. And so I'm very happy to see things moving a certain way. I'm so grateful for Iwan's work and for organizations like Nisa Homes and Sakina, as I mentioned, and the Muslim Advisory Council. And so, yeah, that's probably way too long, but I just want to reiterate the importance of those things. And also, we witnessed in the 90s the movement of social housing from federal to provincial and then to municipal. Municipalities do not have the resources required to produce the amount of social housing we need. And social housing would actually be cheaper to attain than the other alternatives. So I think it takes a multi-pronged strategy to really address the vulnerabilities of families and folks in this city and country.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wafa. We have a lot of engagement and questions, so we'll try to get through with all of them before the webinar ends. I have a question in the chat box. As a frontline worker, what would be the best approach to work with women experiencing IPV, specifically a newcomer woman, without imposing Canadian values?
Hey, this is a great question. In order to prevent or refrain from producing a one-size-fits-all solution, which is what we have experienced with feminist sort of universalizing solutions like VAWA, that actually very detrimentally impacted Indigenous communities, more the women actually than the men. So I would say that the first thing that we need to do is really hone in on what particular group we're talking about. So is it, what are their cultural values or cultural norms? What are their gender relations like? I cannot tell you how many times that interactions between people of my community were actually misread because of a kind of gaze into, there's a misinterpretation that happens. There's very little often interest in understanding one's culture or asking questions of curiosity. But I will say beyond that it is really difficult for women in particular communities to be really honest about intimate partner violence. Existing in a discursive environment where there is such intense Islamophobia, knowing that the carceral system has already really targeted the people and their families in a way that doesn't end up actually relieving intimate partner violence, but just often results in more violence towards the whole family. And we really cannot address intimate partner violence specifically for Arab communities, but I would say for everyone, without addressing housing. Because if there are no freedoms to leave and no choices, then we've seen this. I mean, the frontline workers at Nissa Homes see this all the time, that folks cannot leave if they don't feel like they have another place to go. And I will tell you that without sharing too much information, is that also as an undocumented person in the US for a while, that we couldn't be honest about what was happening in our home because of fears of deportation. So the illegalization of bodies and the continued precarity of documentation is a feminist issue because you cannot actually pursue feminist justice if you're worried about deportation. And especially in a Palestinian case, where will you be deported to, right? So I hope that I'm trying to answer these a little bit more quickly so we can get to more questions.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Wafa. We have another question in our Q&A box. Hello, thank you so much for your session. Truly thought-provoking. I'm working on a program at Syrian Canadian Foundation that works with newcomer/refugee women and survivors of gender-based violence to help start their own business. I'm working on creating survey to analyze the impact of the program through pre/post survey. And you mentioned about the importance of asking meaningful constructs versus demographic questions. Can you please expand on that?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for the work you're doing. I'd love to connect and hear more. This sounds really incredible. And yeah, I think that's just phenomenal work and it's bound to help with social mobility for this population. Yeah, this is a really this is a good question. So the idea is that as we approach research questions or questions around how do we advocate for this group, is that some scholars of intersectionality are arguing that asking about a particular fragmented part of one's identity. So how does anti-racism, or how does, for example, in the Syrian community, one might ask, and I know, of course, not all Syrians are Muslim, but as an example, if people were to ask Syrians, how does Islamophobia impact you? Often so the argument that was made by Lisa Bella, who's a scholar of intersectionality, is that asking that question forces the respondent to disaggregate their identity, that they actually will have a difficult time responding to that question potentially because it is so interconnected to um, all kinds of other forms of oppression. I can tell you that oftentimes follow-up questions can be related to things like, you know, they can cause harm. So I'll tell you, for example, from my perspective, when I do research with Palestinian youth or Palestinian families, I never ask the question, when was the last time you've been to Palestine? And for people in the audience who are Arab, they know exactly what I mean when I say that, because that's quite triggering. Firstly, because it's often used to prove that we have no connection to the land without acknowledging that we actually have structural barriers to going home. So there are I think that with every demographic group that we're working with, we really need to understand what their transnational lives have been like. That oftentimes I feel that in these feminist spaces in Canada, we think about trigger words related to gender-based violence, but we don't think about trigger words around empire, Euro-American hegemony, Euro-American imperialism, settler colonialism, and that these things are just as intimate and violent for us as gender-based violence. So yeah, so I think that the Lisa Bell suggests, and this is an idea, and of course there could be others, is that instead of asking about how does how does sexism affect you or how does anti-racism affect you, that we would ask questions like, what are your experiences of stress? What are your experiences of prejudice? What is your experience of discrimination? And then allowing the respondent to kind of author their own entry point into that with whatever, perhaps maybe they will talk about it in a fragmentary way as well, and that's real for them, or maybe they will offer a kind of holistic new language to describe what prejudice feels like for them. So that's her offering, and I offered it here today, and I think I like it.
Thank you, Dr. Wafa. That was an amazing answer. We also have a question in the chat box directed to you, Dr. Hassan. As an ally, what do you think folks like me can do specifically for Arab Palestinian children? I currently work in transitional housing catering to women and do like to have a proactive approach for children generally. But what specifically, in your opinion, would be helpful for Arab/Palestinian kids?
Okay. This is a great question. And also, thank you. Wow. Like, I just feel like I'm in the company of incredible people that I wish this was in person so we could all meet. This is incredible. Okay. So I'll give you an example of what I feel like has worked for me, and perhaps you may have things that I can learn from as well, since you are immersed in that work in transitional housing. When I work with Palestinian youth, even if I just want to do a 30 or 40-minute interview with them, I actually structure an entire day from 9 to 6 to nourish them so that the 40 minutes is only a tiny component of their day. And what do I mean by nourishing? So I think when I study what is happening in a particular group, I would say with Palestinian children, what they are experiencing the most is silencing, erasure, so the erasure of their identity, silencing of their speech, reprisal, so punishments by teachers, schools, going to the principal without a parent, things like this, being suspended, being kicked out of classes. And then also I'll leave it there. So those are sort of some prominent. Oh, and what I call in my work structural gaslighting. So the ways in which their histories, identities, and even their own embodied experience of violence. Some of them have come literally from Palestine, have lived under occupation. They're told that no, that's not what happened to you. So coming at it from a feminist perspective, where we want to believe women, what I do is I actually employ feminist politics of belief activism, where we believe women, but I employ it for believing Palestinian youth. And I think that that is what is needed. How do we do that? So affirming praxis. So We start the day with a scavenger hunt, and I have to attribute that to some of my volunteers. They're just wonderful teachers from the public school system, where they walk around the room and they find people who like had za'atar that morning, which for Arabs they'll know, or somebody who knows, like a Fairuz song and can sing things like this. And what that does is it affirms their identity that yes, we exist. Yes, we have a culture. Yes, we have a food. Yes, we see each other. And then in some of my studies, what a lot of students have said is they feel alienated. So it remedies that alienation by forcing them to, like, not forcing them, but encouraging them to look at each other and engage. So what I think has been really powerful in the work I've done, at least, is trying to remedy the thing that I'm identifying. So if I'm identifying that students are feeling isolated, they're feeling erasure, silencing, and gaslit, that I try to remedy that in my interactions with them. And then I also offer them tools of social change. So a lot of them didn't know what a trustee was. They didn't know what a superintendent was. They didn't know that there was an equity office in their school. They didn't know, for example, that they could ask to create an affinity group. So then we also offer them tools for empowerment. And I think that the combination of affirmation to remedy the anti-Palestinian racism that they're experiencing and all of the tenets of it, combined with tools of agency and education, are pretty powerful. And I actually like it's a focus group, so it's meant to be kind of boring. But I had students say, can we do this again? So I would say that when we do this work with these communities, we really need to take into account how we do that work ethically, that we're not extracting data from them without giving a lot back. And at the end of the focus groups, we did a mindfulness exercise with a Palestinian psychotherapist. And then she stayed and there was a lineup for one-on-one counseling as well.
Thank you, Dr. Wafa. We actually have three more questions, so we'll try to get through at least one to two before the end of this webinar. I have one question over here. I'm not too sure if you'll be able to expand on that, Dr. Wafa, but please try the best that you can. Somebody in the Q&A box has said that she is curious about the economic landscape for Arab Canadians and Arab Canadian families prior to 2020. Has the economic landscape changed significantly?
That's actually a great question. I don't know the answer to that, as I haven't looked before that. I'm looking at the current moment. But yeah, I'd be interested to take a look and see how that's changed and maybe how that's related to the ways in which social housing has changed. Like now the wait for IPV survivors is like 10 years, I think. It was 1 year when I was going through it. So thanks for the question, but I'll explore that. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. And we'll get to our final question. Hello, Dr. Hassan. Thank you so much for sharing your insights on the matter. I always learn so much from you. Earlier, you mentioned the contradictions of the way belief activism was simultaneously helpful and harmful as you were growing up. I was wondering if you could expand more on that.
Thank you. I can't tell who that's from, but I feel like we know each other. So hello, whoever
Yeah.
I can't see who that is.
Yeah.
I will say maybe it's one of my students, and if so, hi, thank you for coming. Okay, so just to clarify, so let me reiterate. So the belief activism that we need, that is very needed in feminist spaces, in believing survivors, believing women, was the kind of advocacy work that folks did in order to produce places like Interval House, in order to produce fast tracking to social housing for victims of intimate partner violence. So this is a positive thing. And at the same time, we know that belief is attributed to women based on racial logics in different ways. So we know that belief activism does not get offered to Black women the same way it does to white women, to Indigenous women the same way it does to white women. So, for example, missing and murdered Indigenous women have had a very hard time being believed, even in the mainstream feminist movement, even within solidarity. So of course, there's those internal hierarchies of humanization that we need to contend with constantly in feminism, um, and the ways in which histories of white feminism have historically and factually actually often used eugenics or racial logics to actually uplift themselves while actually advocating for the oppression of others. So, in Margaret Jacobs' book, White Mother to a Dark Race, there's actual documentation of white women who were really prominent feminists who were working, who would even advocate for land back for Indigenous communities in the US, but would simultaneously promote residential schooling and the familial fragmentation. So feminism is a really difficult terrain. It can be extremely violent, and oftentimes it can be more difficult to identify the violence within feminist spaces because it operates as a space of progression and of progressiveness and solidarity. So there's that. That's a whole other thing. That's a whole other topic that I teach a lot about, decolonizing feminism, anti-racist feminism, and the way that feminism has been weaponized actually, for as an Arab Muslim, feminism has been weaponized to bomb us and to hurt us. And there's also gender-based violence against Arab and Muslim men, which we saw systematically occur in Iraq, in Abu Ghraib, so we need to also address those kinds of gender-based violences that are also happening. But I will say that I guess, if belief activism isn't applied to other forms of oppression, then it can produce fragmentation. I think that's what I was saying before, is that if we are not believed about our histories, so if I'm believed as a woman for my histories, related to being in a women's shelter, but I'm not believed that I am a Palestinian who is displaced, then what kind of belief activism are we really engaging with? The belief activism itself is also mediated through racial logics and racism. So we need to really confront that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wafa. This was a very insightful and thought-provoking Q&A session. I definitely did enjoy it myself. On behalf of everyone, I would like to sincerely thank you, Dr. Wafa, for the time that you took in preparing your presentation. I definitely did enjoy the knowledge and the expertise that you brought. Thank you again to our speaker and to all of you for attending today's webinar. We hope that the session did inspire continued change and reflection. Thank you once again for joining us, and I hope everyone has a restful weekend. Thank you.